but this is going to get a bit more hands-on. Has anyone here used Unity before? All right, tons of hands, so we can go into some more in-depth stuff here. That's going to be great. Now, let me just show you what I've got prepared. So someone asked about single-player level design. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but mostly we're going to talk about how to set up and use ProBuilder. So firstly, my name is Stephen Waddell. I am somewhat obligated to inform you that I work with the Delta department here on campus, doing some instructional design services. And now that I've said that, I can justify bringing some of my equipment here to do this presentation. This is a little bit farther away from what we would usually be making over at the Delta service office, but we still use ProBuilder from time to time. We actually use it to mock up a level for a landscape architecture grant recently, and I'm actually using it right now in order to put together something for geology class. So the first thing I'd like to do is just go into how to get ProBuilder set up and working. So recently, ProBuilder, to get started, just to define what ProBuilder is, it's essentially a modeling suite that is entirely contained inside of Unity Engine. So it was at one point in time something that an independent group had been developing, and then that group their product was acquired by Unity Technologies, and now it's standard for all versions of Unity ever since about 2018.3. And since about that time, we have had the wonderful package manager to make things nice and complicated. So you might be familiar with the asset store. That's where a lot of these things lived at one time. And now Unity is moving many of its own packages into the package manager. And that's where we're going to find ProBuilder. So once you've opened up your version of Unity, go into Window and Package Manager. And wait for it to load all the packages. And down here, find ProBuilder. 4.05 is, I believe, the latest version. Recently, Unity 2019.3 launched, so there might be a different version that's standard for that. And we're actually going to use another package that we're going to talk about a little bit, although it's a little more simple than ProBuilder is, so we can go over it pretty quickly. In order to take a look at it, though, we're going to need to open up in the advanced menu here and check Show Preview Packages. And then it's going to give you a little error that's basically going to say, are you sure you probably shouldn't use these as shipped game? And then you're going to tell it to go away and install ProGrids. So ProGrids was developed by the same developer and also acquired by Unity Technologies. It essentially makes it possible to work quickly in ProBuilder. So I would say without it, it's only half a level design solution. It makes a lot of things much easier, and I'll demonstrate exactly how in just a moment. Once you have both of these things in your project, there's just going to be an install button you can click here to get it working. You can close this, and both of them are going to be running out of this Tools submenu. So one thing that maybe we'll get to talk about in a future workshop is how easy it is to work with Unity scripting. But for today, just keep in mind that when you install some new package or asset store item, it could be located in a lot of different places. And once we have this up, we can go to ProGrids window.
Sorry, how would you get ProBuilder again?
So ProBuilder is going to be in the package manager window. At one point in time, you would get it from the asset store, and if you're using an older version of Unity, you might still have to get that version from the asset store. But if you're working in 2019, any of those versions, you'll grab it from the package manager. All right, is everyone on the same page? We're able to, awesome. All right, well, once you have ProGrids up, you can find it in the Tools menu. Now we have a variety of different icons, and some of them are a little more inscrutable than others. But to get an idea of what these are doing, I'm actually going to move away from this one real quick and create cube. Now if we turn ProGrids off, and that's what this button here does, it just turns the feature on or off for the entire engine. have the normal movement in Unity. So we turn it on, we're actually going to snap to 1 meter increments. So a fun fact here for anybody who's a bit newer to Unity, the units in Unity are intended to be 1 meter. So if you ever see an amount in the X, Y, or Z category here, that is literally going to be a single meter, and you can use that as reference when you're creating objects or placing them. So we can go in here and change a few things about our snap setting. We want to work in quarter meter increments. Maybe we don't want our scale to snap, so when we scale something, it'll be more dynamic. Or we can go in here and set the scaling up. It'll also follow that scale. And then we have an option called Predictive Grid. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But essentially, everything else is pretty simple here. The one thing that I would like to point out is this little lock toggle here right below the snap button. So I actually didn't know what this was when I first brought in ProGrids, and it confused me for a little while. But essentially what this is going to do is take the grid system for whatever object when you hit the button and apply it to all your other objects. So it essentially makes this grid global. And if we hit this and duplicate that cube, then it's going to snap along the same grid that we've set up for our other cube here. All right, so that's just the snapping with ProGrids. There's a lot of great information on both ProBuilder and ProGrids on the Unity documentation website now, so there's a lot there, and I'll bring that up at the end here. But let's go ahead and get into ProBuilder. That is the name of the workshop. And if we open up the window, you can see we've got tons of options. The only ones that really matter when you're starting to work with this are the New Shape button. Although I will go over some of these other options when we start to take a look at the mock level that I made. So once we have this shape, and if you, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, if you hit the New Shape button, that's just going to make a cube by default. What you want to do instead is hit this little plus button here. That's going to bring up our window. So then we have a variety of different shapes that we can add, and all of them are parametric, so we can make some changes here. And one of the nice things about ProBuilder is that when you're changing these parameters, you're not just scaling this cube the way that you might if you were trying to get a larger or a different sort of shape in Unity itself. You're actually constructing a, in this case, kind of cuboid of that size. So if I hit build, you can see over here in the inspector that this is at scale 1 on all axi. Delete that and go back here, and we can take a look at some of the different objects that are available. We have a prism, which is basically going to be a triangular prism here. Staircases. This one's kind of awesome. Get just a little bit. You get a few options on how many stair steps you want. Create a fully curved staircase, mirror that. And you have all your other parameters on height, width, and depth. And you've got a few others here, some that are more architectural. And the by default, you'll see that the door doesn't actually have some of the faces on the edges here. That's so you can extrude them and start to create your walls. So by default, this is an isosphere, so you're going to get a lot of these triangles on the side. Really cool for like geodesic domes. So looking at the different tools, it might be best to just go ahead and jump into this environment and start taking a look at the way that this was assembled. So this essentially has 3 different sections. It's basically designed to be a third-person single-player game, so we're not going to focus as much on oppositional spawn points or sight lines or PvP type action. Instead, we're going to think a little bit more about these different single-player sections and how they're going to interact with the player versus the environment. So I heard a comment about Dark Souls earlier. Anybody out here played the first Dark Souls game? A couple of people. There's a fairly infamous section in the game where you're running up a large castle. There's this huge incline and there's a few archers at the top that are shooting at you. And you're trying to get to those archers so that you can knock them off the parapet and get up to that level. It's an example of how you can use elevation in single-player games to create stopgaps and to start to force players to be a bit more careful. So this staircase section here is sort of based around that concept. So if we were to put some sort of ranged enemy up at the top of these landings, then that's going to promote a more careful approach. Then from there we're leading into a large open space that has a variety of different columns. This is creating a little bit of cover for our player. We're also getting a bit of open area that we can use to create more maneuverability. And then we're coming into a tighter space here with a lot of obstacles, and we're going to use that small, more confined space to give ourselves some pacing. So that's where we can start the player off down here. They ascend this way, fighting normal enemies. They get to what might be a boss encounter or some kind of more meaty interaction there. And then after that, you might have some sort of cutscene or information coming through when they're moving through this more constricted area. And then you have the goal on the other side. So let's take a look at some of these more complex shapes, and we'll see how we can build this out using the ProBuilder. Start with a cylinder and try to build that up into a column. Into a few more sides there. Now you're going to notice when you open up ProBuilder for the first time, 4 buttons up here that weren't there before. So these are different forms of selection. And I'm going to switch over to faces. Select this group, and now I can move them up and down. And you're going to notice that we have a texture applied here that's going to give us a bit of a height reference for anything that we're building in ProBuilder. It can be really useful for maybe taking a look at these walls and determining that we need a 6 meter tall cylinder if we were going to make a full-size column. Another thing that we can do in ProBuilder is hit Shift and move up, across, and start to extrude faces. So that way we can start to build something really funky really fast. In this case though, I kind of want to change a bit of the radius here. So what we can do there is go over here to extrude faces, and if we hit that, and change our pivot. That down and then snap it down. Hit Shift and move it up. And now we've changed the radius of that column base. So if we want to build something like what we're seeing over here, we might move this up a bit. We're actually going to switch modes and move this out so it's not quite as distracting. Hit Shift, move up, hit R. Scale that down. Hit Shift again. So if you remember nothing else from what I've said today, if you go into ProBuilder, hit Shift and select something, that's extrude. It's a very quick way to work. And then once you have something like this, if you wanted to put it in context, with ProGrids on, you can just kind of move it into place. Also have a few different modes available here with some different tools. And you're going to see the different tools we have available will change based off those selection modes. So if we go into Objects, this will change back to a more basic group. Go to Vertices, we get some vertice-based tools like welding, setting the pivot, or splitting the vertices. This might make more sense if you have any experience using something like 3ds Max or Blender. Otherwise, there's a really great battery of documentation on ProBuilder available from Unity Technologies, like I was mentioning earlier. And that'll be a great place to look into these individual tools and determine what they're doing. So one thing we might run into pretty quickly is the need to have more geometry in this, so we can insert an edge loop by selecting the edges. And if you hold Shift while you're selecting, you can select multiple items at once. Scale this out to make it a bit more rounded.
Is there a hotkey to like select a ring of edges?
Yep. So if we have edge select mode on, and let's find a further example. If you double click an edge, it's going to attempt to select that edge ring. It's a little bit finicky though.
Yeah. Thank you.
You also have some options over here to select edge loops or edge rings. So apart from the basic shape-based work you can do in ProBuilder, they actually do have Messier Curves as part of the package. So if you were to go over here, select Bezier shape. It's going to spawn in the middle of nowhere. Click on these handles, start moving this around like a pipe, or case up here like a vine, and then add new points along the edges here. Now this actually turns some shape like that, so if you go ahead and put one down. You can add new points by clicking at different points along the curve. You'll see you have different handles that you can work with as well. So if I click this guy and this handle, change how it's handling that point on the curve. So this can be very useful to get very quick wires, mocking up cables and pipes.
How reliable are the collisions on this? Or do you have to worry about that?
So this is using mesh collisions. Almost all the ProBuilder shapes will be. This means that if you make something super complicated, Unity will yell at you for it, and it will have a pretty big impact on gameplay. But on its own, if you make something that's not crazy, it should be reasonably reliable. Now, if you were to make something like super funky, I don't know that I would trust this section at that point. It might be a bit open.
Can you make it so that it doesn't have a gap in it? Or is there any way to increase the number of faces or something?
So you also have some stuff in the editor that you can do. So you can add a point, we'll just add one at wherever it's starting. Close loop. Just moving. Even change the vector type. So if we move it from a line to something like a broken vector, then we can make some changes to that.
Can you change it from something, like from pipeline to something else, like more geometric?
So if we select any of these different face selection modes, or any of these different geometry selection modes, we can mess with it as if it was a traditional and use all the same all the same ProBuilder tools to start to edit. last thing I wanted to talk about really briefly is the material editor window, and it has dumped all my materials out for some reason, so I need to come back in here. This is a great way to start getting some different signal colors potentially in your level design. So for instance, right now, green in this level means it's destructible, so at some point during the game it might be destroyed and turned into rubble. Ideally, if you were actually working on this, you might also model out the destroyed version. This is a work in progress as far as this level goes. In fact, it may not see the outside of this workshop, but we'll see. See a few different things around here that represent these different elements. These were made using the Messier Curves. Go down here, we can see some of the rubble. And this was just a cube that had its vertices pulled out and placed in different directions. So we're going to be exchanging this for something more reasonable anyway later on. So we might as well just put something that visually symbolizes what we're trying to accomplish and move on. Broken columns and this tighter entryway, and our wonderful staircases that are still only pretty awesome because sometimes the step size can be very deceitful. All right, and an archway over here. As a quick bonus, we can talk a little bit, just a little bit about lighting in Unity. Has anybody worked with the lighting editor in Unity before? All right, new information. So once we've set up our scene here, we have everything where we want it to be, we can go in and mark everything static. And that's us telling the editor, we're going to move this during edit time, but when the game starts, nothing's going anywhere. And then that can allow it to determine that all of these things need a light map, and that light map won't be changing during the game. You can make it change other ways, but I'm not going to go into that too much right now. Once we've marked everything static, we can go into rendering and lighting settings. This is where Unity keeps its fairly extensive light mapper. And I would advise anyone in here that's interested in messing with lighting in Unity to just play around with a lot of these different items and take a look at the documentation. But once you've set everything to static and you hit generate lighting, that might be all you need for whatever you're working on at the time. That's going to give you a nice baked light map, including things like indirect lighting coming off of our Skybox here, which is only barely not the default Skybox for Unity. I changed the ground color just to show that you can. And over here we're going to have some lighting errors, so sometimes it requires a little bit of fiddling with to get it right. And it can take a long time to run lighting, so be aware that once you hit that button, you're making a commitment. Alright, so I have a third-person controller in here. This is by Invector. Unity at one point in time provided a third-person controller as part of their standard assets, and then they decided after 2017.3 that they were no longer going to have standard assets. So you can pick this one up by Invector on the asset store. It's pretty nice. I can generally recommend it. Just going to pull up the asset store page here. And I didn't want to do that. I never want to open up Microsoft Edge. But this is what it looks like. It's one of the, it looks a little bit like an Unreal Engine 4 character controller, which was honestly the best I could hope for. If I hit play, we can actually run around the scene a little bit. So before we do that, let's maximize that guy. And without enemies in here, it's hard to get a complete picture of the level. But we can at least start getting an idea of what these different areas look like. Has anybody here seen The Expanse, by the way? There's a bit in that show about doorways and corners. It's also a useful thing to make your players wary of. So anybody who's played Dark Souls knows that you move kind of slowly through that game because at any point in time something might jump out at you and murder you. Which is a good thing. It's a good thing to inspire new players. we can get a sense of the scale of this. And an idea of how long it takes to move through here. So it's a pretty quick walk without anything there to stop you. But at the very least, this shows some thought given to what the player is going to go through to get to different places and what those areas are going to look like for placing enemies and side things. All right, well, I've kind of rushed through this, so now I can open up the floor to more questions or any kind of start to clarify any confusion that might be left over after this sort of lightning talk on ProBuilder. So does anybody have anything that they want to bring up?
What would be the advantages of using ProBuilder versus using something like just Blender and importing the models into the VGDC?
So there's really two different potential advantages. One would be speed. Once you start to get working with ProBuilder, something like this can take, I was still learning a bit myself, and this took me about 2 or 3 hours to get to this point. I'd probably want to put a lot more time into it before I was ready to call it production level. But at the very least, it kind of gets the conversation working. This is made to work in Unity. You can work very quickly with it. And once you're done with it, you can grab the whole thing, go to ProBuilder, and export it. Allegedly. So you would have to select all your ProBuilder assets, which is a quick way to do that. So the other reason that you might use this over something like Blender is that you're trying to do something dynamically in the game itself and you don't want to run through your pipeline. So if you make something in Blender, you have to make sure that it's ready to go into Unity first. So let's say you're most of the way done through a level, you've got some geometry off in the distance that players aren't going to pay a lot of attention to, you've got material that will work very well with it if you can just edit the UVs correctly. You can very quickly make something in ProBuilder that will approximate that need. So maybe it's a tree off in the distance or a rock, or you're trying to cover up a particular part of the geometry. In that case, it can be a very quick in-place modeler that's pretty easy to use.
Is it, sorry, kind of a follow-up question. Is ProBuilder as complex as Blender and Maya?
No. So the trade-off is that once you learn all the buttons in ProBuilder, you know ProBuilder. You're not going to be bringing, well, you might be bringing custom scripts into ProBuilder if you want to work with something on a more custom pipeline. But for the most part, it's got a pretty limited set of tools that are going to do individual things. If you go into something like Blender, especially in Maya, because of its long track record, people have used tools that were originally intended for one thing for something completely different, and you have to learn to work with those changes in pipeline over time. So I'd say the complexity of ProBuilder is a lot more manageable compared to something like Blender or Maya.
Are materials applied per face or for the whole object?
It depends on what you made. So different ProBuilder objects may behave slightly differently. ProBuilder also has its own UV editor. So if you selected something like this, with the UV editor, you can take a look at what its UVs are set as. You can see over here, as I move this around, the texture is combine this with something like Uber or even the standard shader in Unity, you can get some really awesome effects with tessellation and bump maps. So something to think about.
So, I guess, is that material editor in ProBuilder actually something you could use like for a final project that wasn't like super serious?
Definitely. ProBuilder has most of the same tools that you would want from any basic 3D modeler. I mean, if you were working on something really complex, you might want like a knife tool, or some other more complex items that you would find in something like Blender. But if you wanted to go in here and edit your smoothing groups. You actually have access to that too. So then you can select different faces here. I do take some umbrage with the way that they do some of the selection. I can place in a different smoothing group. Now suddenly all those faces are smooth compared to the ones over here that are still blocky. So you do have access to some things that you wouldn't really expect to see directly in Engine.
That's cool.
I see shift difference in the ProBuilder window. Is that kind of a difference, like subtracting tool for modeling? Like you sort two objects and then if you're just rid of this one and then leaving a space.
So we have different options here. So this is more the landing page documentation. You can start to see some information. So let's take a look at shift. So that's actually selection based. I was wondering if that was Boolean tools as well, because that would be really nice to have. But it looks like that's based around your box selection. Do that. Which is also a good thing to have, because selection can get really messy once you have something more complex on screen.
I want to know what you made this for really badly. Are you allowed to share?
Oh, definitely. So this is actually something I'm working on myself. I've been working with a group called Unlit Games for the better part of 2 years now. When that starts to wrap up, I'd like to start working on something I've been cooking up for a while. It's a dungeon crawling third-person shooter type game. So the idea is that you would have a character with some aerial mobility, and that's where some of these extra platforms come in and some of the additional verticality. And it's also why these things are out here kind of randomly floating here. The idea being that if we have a character that's standing on this pillar, we don't want them to be able to run over to the goal.
Yeah.
So we're going to put an invisible wall there and tell them no.
Alright. Cool. I was wondering what that exit, that one little platform was out there. Makes sense now.
And we even have some of these that are a little bit blocked off, so it changes how we're looking at these different places that we can go. So let's say that we have a swarm of enemies here. We have a boss fight that's spawning enemies during the boss fight.
Yeah.
Our player might decide that they want to get out of this larger area and start to funnel those enemies. So they might run onto this platform. And the limited amount of space is going to give them somewhere to sort of stage enemies if they want to move from here to another adjacent platform and run back in. So it kind of gives a little bit more potential dynamic to that sort of situation.
I like that.
When you create an object in ProBuilder, does it allow you to shift the pivot point within the object?
That is a good question. So yes, we can. If we go and make ourselves a new cube, push it over here. Actually go in and select a vertex. We have to build the cube first. Go down here, we can set the pivot based off that vertex. Go to pivot, come back out here, and see that we now have a pivot. Also set it based off of lines. Although that seems like it changed. Oh yeah, so the pivot is also going to be used for your UV mapping as well. So if you change the pivot, you might change the way that your texture is currently working, so be aware. Alright, so I would encourage all of you that are interested in doing some practical level design, grab Unity and go get ProBuilder and maybe give it a shot. I would definitely recommend using ProGrids. I actually came through here a few weeks ago and started demoing ProBuilder for Alberto whenever we were talking about how this talk was going to go. and it was a bit of a mess. ProGrids helped make it possible to snap everything together in a more reasonable, cohesive way. And whenever you start to duplicate objects, it's very easy to put them in different places, to create different geometry really fast. Just like that, you can start to change the way the layout works. Add some sticking. If you have any questions, you can always come by and ask some people in the club. I'm sure all of our officers will be experts on this very shortly. We're starting
I have like kind of the same question again. Do you know if you import any assets from 3ds, Blender, or Maya into Unity, if you can change the pivots, the local pivots within those?
The best way to do it at that point is to set a parent transform. So if we create a non-ProBuilder object, cube, pull it all the way out here, and we decide we want to grab it from the corner, take that cube, put up the hierarchies, I've got all these things parented. And we can create a new empty object. Parenting our cube to that empty object. We can move the cube inside of that object, and it's going to change the relative pivot point. Set that off for this demonstration. So if we want to put that at a corner, we can go in here and change that so it's maybe negative 0.5. So you're not really changing the pivot of the object itself in the data. You're more changing how this individual object is moving according to your level design practices. So in all reality, if you wanted to change that pivot, you probably want to go back to Blender, alter the pivot there, and re-export it. Thank you guys for your time. Thank you for joining me and Alberto here. I know it's been a long workshop, so I'm glad that you stuck it out. If there's any additional questions or you want to ask me or Alberto something, we'll be here for a second.